Well, thank you so much. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here. This is the first briefing for the Asia Partners DC at the Stopenon Group with my colleagues, Dr. Emmanuel Pastrach and Mr. Andrew Hyde. And just a couple of brief remarks before I introduce my colleagues. The implication of the political dynamics here in Washington, D.C. for American policy towards Northeast Asia is extremely important and evolving all the time. That is why we have decided to come together as folks that have experts in Asia and Asia-related issues to try to help American companies that need help with the continent, or Asian companies that want to expand here in the United States. The unprecedented political situation in the United States opens the opportunity for experts such as ourselves to be able to help develop the ongoing relations between the United States and all of the various countries in Asia, which is one of the largest and fastest growing region around the world. As I mentioned, this is not a normal time for the U.S. in Northeast Asia. Increasing tensions with Beijing over trade and security issues, uncertainty over the U.S. cooperation with Tokyo, and differences of perspective concerning alliances, revelations, trade, and North Korea with Seoul will continue to be critical issues, no matter how distracted we are here in Washington, D.C. by the political environment. These are issues that we will be willing to explore and having our expertise hopefully help the companies interested. I, for one, just retired a few years ago after 27 years of service, being the Chief of Staff to the former Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where I worked on many issues and with many leaders dealing with international relations. So I worked in a personal office, but had the opportunity to work with the leaders of many different countries, was able to travel to about 20 countries all over the world, mainly in Asia. So it's a great pleasure, and I'm very proud to be working with these experts who have been working with policy on Asia for so many years. Our first person that I will introduce, our first partner, his name is Mr. Andrew Hyde. He's a former U.S. diplomat with the State Department for more than 28 years, with experience in trade, military, and alliance issues, and U.S. diplomat policy towards Northeast Asia. Mr. Hyde is engaged in a broad effort to develop strategies to improve U.S. relations with Northeast Asia. So, my friends, let me introduce to you Mr. Hyde. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Art, and thank you very much for arranging this briefing. I think for us, this is, as you mentioned, I think a really opportune time, opportune moment in American politics and in our relationships with Northeast Asia. And I think it provides us some chance to take a step back, perhaps, and reflect upon how the U.S. is being perceived overseas, and what the implications of that can be for U.S. policy and for our partnerships in Northeast Asia. What I wanted to talk to a little bit about in this briefing is to talk about how the U.S. political discord, in particular, has affected our relationships with the two major countries in Northeast Asia, Japan and the Republic of Korea. It is clearly having a profound impact, and it's an accumulating impact. I think we initially, at the beginning of the current administration, there had been a lot of concern, but not a lot of experience and evidence to back that up. But now, as we are here today, even there are impeachment hearings going on downstairs. There's a very polarized political environment here in Washington. And that is, I think, building perceptions abroad in many places, but particularly in Northeast Asia, that there is a fundamental weakness in American political leadership, and a lack of real interest in global affairs among American political leaders. I think this is causing a number of things to happen, a number of trends, a number of movements are going on in that context. First, I think, and most importantly, the countries, again, this is a feature of many countries around the world, but I think there's some particular aspects of Northeast Asia that I will go into. But it is forcing a recalculation among our allies about the commitment of U.S. leadership, the direction of U.S. leadership, and the durability of U.S. leadership. And as a result, what we see is some hedging strategies that are coming along, both domestically, which my colleague, Mr. Pastorich, will touch on, but also, I think, internationally by the allies. Hedging strategies with relation to China, relation to each other, relation to the region, and globally. But before I really get into the discord, what I thought is I also wanted to touch on two other aspects of the current environment that are closely related to the discord. As these countries look at the U.S. and they try to read what is actually happening here, they find they can't. I mean, it's very hard to understand what's going on, to analyze it. It moves at rapid speed, and any analysis necessarily involves a degree of prediction, and people are at a loss to really predict what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, much less what will happen, next year during presidential elections and going forward. So, first of all, I think there's one thing that has been clear to a lot of our allies is that there is definitely a reduced U.S. interest and commitment to international relations in general and alliances in particular. One feature of that, I think, has been clear is that diplomacy has taken on much more a transactional nature than has been true in the past. It's always had a transactional element to it. That's often how you actually mark the passage of relationships, is through transactions. But the transactions have been as I say, a window into the larger partnership. Now they seem to be the extent of the partnership. And so I think right now, today, we have this example where the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, are in Seoul to discuss burden sharing with an apparent demand to quintuple the amount that the Koreans have been paying. And for anyone who's been involved in these negotiations before, and I have personally, the idea that you're going to get 5 times the amount that you've gotten in the past is beyond belief. But that is the U.S. position, and it is seen as a sort of end in itself. A transaction, if you want American troops there, this is what it's going to cost. You're going to have to pay the full freight. We're going to just complete this transaction, and not really looking at the larger relationship. I think the other thing that you cannot underestimate in Northeast Asia and among the country, with Koreans and Japanese, is that they look around the world and look at U.S. relations with other parts of the world, and ask themselves, what is the U.S. commitment to a long-term, durable security relationship? They see that a lot of the noise that has come out of the relationship with NATO. Again, there's a transactional element to it, money, who's paying what. Burden sharing is a term that we've used in the past, but this goes beyond burden sharing with a very, very sharp focus just on the money side of it, and not so much the longer-term perspective. Another country I've been very involved in is Afghanistan, where we currently have over 10,000 U.S. troops, and there's a sense that the president wants to just get troops out of Afghanistan kind of no matter what. There was a peace agreement potentially it was pulled back, so that was maybe runs a little bit counter to that narrative, but the general narrative is the U.S. wants to get out of Afghanistan, come what may, and reduce the expenses, reduce the exposure of U.S. troops. And again, I think the Koreans and Japanese wonder, with U.S. troop concentrations in their countries, will we be next? Obviously, there's not a war going on in those countries, but they wonder, is the U.S. approach to troops in Afghanistan similar to what we're going to face here? The other thing that I think goes along with the transactional part and adds to reduced U.S. commitment is really the excessive reliance on personal relationships at the top. And that has always been a feature of our relations with other countries. How do the leaders get along? But there's always been underneath it a strong and very complex institutional relationship at multiple levels, in the State Department, in the Hill, across society. And I think incumbents in the White House have recognized and capitalized on that. But we don't see that so much now. We have a sense from the White House that the president's relationship with leaders of other countries is the only thing that matters. And he said that himself at times. And I think that comes at the detriment of an understanding and an awareness of what the long-term U.S. interests are, because it hinges on one person as opposed to the institutions and the nation. And then the other element that I think can't be ignored in terms of U.S. reduced interest and commitment is the fact that our foreign policy has much less of a reliance on values than it used to have. That we had, human rights as an issue, for example, for many years, and that was a feature of our relationship with many, many countries around the world and was a guiding light for us. We don't see that as much anymore. Again, if you're really relying on transactional and you're looking at sort of deals, values don't really fit into that scenario. And so I think that sort of reduction of values has also left people uncertain as to where the U.S. is going. So those are really the two things. I think U.S. reduced interest and commitment and then uncertainty. But let me go back to the sort of main point of today's meeting, which is really to talk about the political discord in the U.S. Between the parties. And that's, as we know, that permeates. I don't really need to tell this group kind of the nature of the discord. I think it's complete. But it does present some unique analytical challenges to our principal Asian allies. I sort of recognize, I see four results from the discord in terms of how it impacts the alliance. First of all, they observe a self-obsessed U.S. We're here in the U.S. Capitol, we're in the House of Representatives, and just 2 floors below us, as I mentioned in the impeachment hearings going on, impeaching the President of the United States. This is very important, obviously, for America, for the world, as to what this goes on, but as to how this unfolds. But it means that there's less room at the top here for focus on what's going on in other parts of the world and for sort of an awareness. So Washington's a little kind of consumed with itself right now, and there's not a lot of bandwidth for foreign policy. And again, I think the cost is we lose nuance in relationships, in understanding relationships and acting on relationships, and we lose detail. A lot of the detail, a lot of the relationships I've certainly been involved in my diplomatic career, the details matter. The details are often the real engine of the relationship. If it's scientific agreements in certain areas, or if it's aspects of trade and technology transfer, or security policy, these details are very important and fuel and basically serve as the fundamental basis for the relationship. I think a lot of that, with the concentration of the relationship at the top and the focus on Washington, what you're seeing is that there's a lot less of that detail, and so a lot of relationships, I think, are growing more brittle and more frail in many respects than they have been in the past. They also see, I think, other countries, and in Tokyo and Seoul, also see a foreign policy environment here in the U.S. that's driven much more by domestic political concerns. I don't even need to go into impeachment in Ukraine. I think everyone knows that story, but that's only part of a larger trend, and this actually extends back to previous administrations, so I don't want to just pin it on this administration. But you do see sort of the fact that domestic political concerns have become a much more of an upfront consideration for how foreign policy is conducted, what our strategies are, what our tactics are, where we're going with other countries. And so that is something that's new for many countries looking at the U.S. Obviously, in the past, any country looks at its foreign policy through the lens of domestic considerations, national interest, but often there used to be a phrase we used in the State Department that political differences end at the water's edge. That there was an understanding that we could have a bipartisan foreign policy. Yes, it was founded on American interests and American values, but these were goals that transcended party differences. That's not the case anymore. The other thing I think that other countries, a third thing that countries observe very much in the U.S. right now is that they sense a lot less willingness and scope for compromise in U.S. politics. That there's really much more of a sense of it's my way or the highway on both sides of the aisle. And they see this sort of winner-take-all, demolish the opposition mentality. And that's obviously happening domestically, but I think they also see that as the domestic politics gets translated into the international relationships, they see less willingness to compromise internationally as well. And that is something that makes it very hard to enter into a negotiation if you sort of know already that your adversary or a person on the other side of the table has basically said, here's the way we're going to do it. I'm not really interested in having much of a discussion unless you just do it my way. Finally, I would say that they also look at, a lot of focus on the administration. That's true in any administration and what the president and his cabinet and others are doing. But I think they also sense that there's not a lot of coherence necessarily that's come out of the U.S. domestic political opposition, the Democrats. They look at the contrast, for example, between what's going on here downstairs in impeachment and a Democratic Party leadership that seems to be pretty unified at this stage. Maybe with some underlying fractures we saw earlier this year, but right now a degree of unification in Congress in Washington. But then they look at the presidential primary contest where we have 17 candidates and we now have maybe 2 more coming in, standing for all sorts of range of views, speaking possibly about on behalf of the Democratic Party in a lot of directions. What does this mean? Where does this go? What do we make of this in this kind of polarized political environment? I think there's a lot of confusion there and a lot of concern. They see in the Democratic Party, I think, a kind of lurch to the left that's been going on. And again, I think seasoned political observers would say, well, this is kind of typical at this stage in the process, that you might have the extremes of either party speaking out at this point when it's party activists who will be preparing to vote in primaries next year and other things. But nonetheless, there's not a clarity as to how long this will last or how serious it is. I think there's a number of the Democratic candidates that also provoke concerns in Seoul and Tokyo in statements they've made again about troops. I mean, this is something where I think objectively you can look at the U.S. and say a lot of the things about American troops abroad transcends both parties. At least the concept of endless wars, as the president calls them. You don't have many people on the Democratic side standing up and saying, yeah, we want to keep fighting an endless war. So this is I think this is a real issue that they look at, and they're just not sure that, well, if we ever have a change in administration or a change in balance of power, is that going to really change some of these fundamental sort of tectonic plate movements that are going on in the American foreign policy approach? And then, looking at the Republicans here in Congress, I think, there's a lot of unity right now to support the president, and I think that's, in part driven by the president's popularity among Republicans. But I think, there could be cracks that would show up there, and then where does the Republican Party go from there? I will leave, further discussion of that to others, but I just think those are, you can't look at this and not sort of look at the two sides, and try to assess how they are moving forward and what that means for alliances. So finally, let me just wrap up with mentioning that I think the result of this discord in particular, but also the reduced U.S. interest commitment, as well as the uncertainty, those sort of the trifecta, really has had some number of visible effects already. I think it's contributed to the tensions between Korea and Japan. The U.S. used to play a mediating role much more. The U.S. used to step in long before things got to the stage they are now and say, folks, we all have common interests, common concerns here. Let's dial down the tensions. I don't see that happening now, and I'm not sure it's going to be happening. I also think that you will see, and you're seeing this a little bit, but you'll see more accommodation by those two countries and others in Asia towards China. China is clearly, viewed from Washington, China is an adversary that needs to be taken quite seriously and needs to be confronted. But we're far away in Washington. We have the heft, if you will, to do that. Countries that are much closer, much more dependent on Chinese trade and Chinese military influence, maybe you have to make a different calculation because they're not really sure where the U.S. is and where the U.S. is going to be standing at their side. So I think that you'll see in some of those areas and others, I mean, I could go into more, certainly in the trade area, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative on the Chinese part, you see a lot of countries, again, kind of hedging, saying, well, I'm not really sure where the U.S. is, and so I'm going to have to make a calculation here to kind of make sure I'm covering all my bets going forward. So I think maybe I'll end there, and I'll certainly welcome any questions, but I will turn it over to back to Art. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, as you all were able to appreciate, Mr. Hyde gave a brilliant analysis in a short period of time of the complex political issues here in the United States and throughout Northeast Asia. The good news is that between him and I, we have 55 years of experience here in Washington, D.C., in the legislative side and the executive side. And so we're happy to help any folks that are looking to this kind of guidance, as Mr. Hyde, who spoke as a true experienced diplomat, stated that there are many different ongoing and evolving issues. And with our experience, we could help, as well as our next colleague, Dr. Emmanuel Paskresh, who is also the director, besides being principal at the Asia Partners. He's a director of the Asia Institute, which is a think tank with offices in Washington, D.C., Seoul, Tokyo, and Hanoi. Dr. Paskresh has extensive experience working with the Korean and Japanese government and business leaders and writing about current issues, including business, trade, political, for audiences in Asia and the United States. A brilliant gentleman himself, he's fluent in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. I mean, that's not an easy task. But he's devoted his efforts to promoting a dialogue on emerging challenges in Northeast Asia and in this period of rapid changes. So it is also with great pleasure for me to introduce and invite Dr. Paskresh to join us, and he will be saying a few words. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stefanon, for inviting me, and it's a great honor also to be right after Mr. Hyde, who gives a very thoughtful analysis of what's actually happening on the ground right here, ground zero. So I just wanted to say a few words as someone who just came back from 12 years in Asia about how this current situation here in Washington, certain degree of institutional and political paralysis, and also, as Mr. Hyde suggested, paralysis at the level of vision, which is in some ways the most serious issue we face, how that has affected Northeast Asia, specifically South Korea and Japan. So the most common question I get from Koreans and Japanese when I'm there is, who do we talk to in the Trump administration? Because they all, I mean, basically people feel they're not really sure who to talk to, and I can't actually answer their question. So there has been, and it's quite a serious issue, this inability to identify where the center of power is in the United States, how the system works, and sometimes, I think in a way that's not always so helpful, Americans on the political side will make up stories. And this is how it works, even though they don't fully understand themselves, leading to just more complex misunderstandings. And we have seen an enormous degree of political fragmentation, as Mr. Hyde suggested. To some degree, that's resulted in reverting to autopilot, which works for the most part, but it doesn't work, as you probably know, autopilot doesn't work forever, right? It has a lifespan or a half-life to it, and we're starting to get to the limits. So this combination of impeachment downstairs right now, the current visit of Secretary of Defense Mark Esper to South Korea to discuss both this quadrupling of the request for Seoul's covering of expensive U.S. troops, combined with the move to deploy short-range nuclear missiles in Northeast Asia, which is another part of the agenda, which from our perspective may make sense, but from the Chinese perspective, I think is being discussed in China on the level of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis as a sort of fundamental threat. And this is also combined with issues within American politics. I mean, we have, for example, on the issue of defense, this the Jedi controversy between Microsoft and Amazon, which is, I mean, becomes sort of a showdown between two multi-billionaires in what ought to be normally a straightforward defense policy discussion. And that has profound implications for how we are perceived. What I guess what we really need to talk about, or what we'll need to do going forwards, is this introductory discussion about how the U.S. interacts with Japan and with South Korea is the starting point for what I hope will be a continued dialogue, and to some degree we've already started that, is to put forth some sort of vision for what the United States' role in Northeast Asia will be in the future. Right? That to some degree what we've had is a response to Trump to say, President Trump, we don't agree with these points, we're opposed. But it's been actually quite difficult to find a vision, say, beyond that, in terms of what the United States' constructive contribution will be to peace and prosperity and stability in Asia. And that those, both the details of what will actually be done, as Mr. Hyde suggested, we have to have follow-up. We can't just have summit meetings. We have to have every level beneath with concrete substance to be implemented in a mutual manner. But we also need some sort of a vision, some sort of a belief system which will underlie that. And I think there's a real hunger, I felt in Asia, for exactly that. Some sort of real sort of beliefs, some sort of value system that would undergird a renewed American commitment in Northeast Asia. So I think I will leave it there at this point. I don't think we're finished by any means, but I think there's profound need for a very honest discussion. And when I speak to people in Korea and South Korea and in Japan, I can feel that real need for an honest, frank, but also forward-looking and constructive dialogue on what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bashras. Very, very well elaborated. In a global economy, that's exactly what we need. In the United States being one of the most powerful countries in the world, the leadership of the United States is extremely important, as Dr. Bashras mentioned. But unfortunately, there is a lack of that vision, and our allies and others see that. And I'm sorry to say that not only in Northeast Asia, but in Latin America, which is an area that I know very well as well, the same thing is happening. There are several revolutions springing up throughout Latin America, in part because China is no longer buying their natural resources as they were before. So their GDPs of those economies in Chile, in Ecuador, in Peru, amongst others, were growing at 3 or 4%. And now that China is not, because of the world slowdown in growth, has slowed down, they're not purchasing those natural resources. Now the people have decided to begin revolutions and so on and so forth. So, and obviously Latin America is a very important region for the United States because they are neighbors toward the south. So it's all a global economy, it's all intertwined, and Andrew, Emmanuel, and I, as well as our partners in South Korea and in Japan, are very happy to help any leaders who may need a better understanding. We will try to puzzle the pieces together and be as helpful as possible. But we'd like to thank you so much for taking your time, listening. We're going to have some Q&A now, and then we will hopefully continue with this effort, which is just getting started. This is our first briefing, so we will turn off the presentation now. but we'd like to thank you and stay tuned. We're developing a website and we're social media, so we'll give you more information. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you.